Hello and welcome. Today we're going to examine one of the most emotionally charged subjects in modern politics, the claim that one political party represents good while another represents evil. These accusations have become increasingly common. They influence elections, divide families, shape public opinion, and often end meaningful discussion before it ever begins. But before we can answer whether those claims are justified, we need to ask a more fundamental question. What do the words good and evil actually mean? Are they political values? Or are they something entirely different? Throughout this presentation, we'll take a constitutional approach rather than a partisan one. Instead of defending one political party or criticizing another, we'll examine the concepts themselves. Our goal is not to determine who is right. Our goal is to develop a better way to think. It doesn't matter which election you watch or which news source you follow. Sooner or later you'll hear someone claim that either Republicans or Democrats are evil. Each claims to defend justice. Both claim to defend freedom. Each side often believes the other represents a danger to the country. These accusations are powerful because they appeal to our emotions. Once someone has been labeled evil, discussion becomes much more difficult. Compromise begins to look like surrender. Disagreement begins to look like betrayal. But before accepting any of these labels, we should first ask whether we're even using the right categories. Political labels have consequences. They influence how people vote, whom people trust in friendships, workplaces, even families. When political disagreements become moral judgments, people stop assuming good faith. Instead of asking why someone reached a different conclusion, they begin assuming that person's motives must be corrupt. Over time, this erodes the trust that allows a constitutional republic to function. If citizens begin viewing one another as enemies instead of fellow Americans, self-government becomes increasingly difficult. That is why understanding the idea of good and evil matters. This brings me to the central question of today's presentation. Are good and evil actually political values? Or are we placing moral labels onto something they were never intended to describe? The Declaration of Independence identifies the purpose of government. The Constitution establishes the structure of government. Neither document tells us to classify political parties as good or evil. Instead, they focus on the proper use of governmental power. Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Whenever we encounter an emotionally charged political claim, logical thinking suggests that we slow down and go through the process. First, define the terms. Second, examine the assumptions. Third, analyze the consequences. This is the same approach engineers use when solving technical problems, and it's the same approach scientists use when testing hypotheses. It should be the same approach citizens and politicians use when evaluating public policy. Rather than beginning with conclusions, the process requires we begin with definitions. Only after we understand the categories involved can we fairly evaluate whether a political action, policy, or institution deserves any particular label. Before we can discuss good and evil, we first need to understand what government exists to accomplish. The Declaration of Independence provides the answer. It tells us that all people are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It then tells us that governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. That statement is remarkable because it identifies the purpose of government before it describes the structure of government. So, before we talk about Congress, the President, or the Supreme Court, we should understand why government exists in the first place. These three ideas, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are America's founding principles and our shared values. They are the objectives that a constitutional republic is supposed to protect. Every policy, every law, and every public decision should ultimately be evaluated by asking whether it helps secure those three principles. Although life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness form the foundation, they cannot exist without several supporting values. Justice ensures that laws are applied fairly. Security protects people from violence, invasion, and lawlessness. Prosperity allows individuals and families to build productive lives. Equality before the law ensures that government treats citizens according to the same legal standards rather than according to wealth, status, race, religion, or political affiliation. These supporting values are important because they strengthen the three foundational values. Justice protects liberty. Security protects life. Prosperity expands opportunities to pursue happiness. Equality before the law protects all three. Notice that these are constitutional objectives. They describe what government should strive to secure, not which political party should receive credit for pursuing them. Now let's introduce a completely different category. The words good and bad describe outcomes. They describe results. They describe consequences. They describe effects. Suppose a city builds a new bridge. If the bridge safely carries traffic for decades, we would probably call that a good outcome. If the bridge collapses because of a design flaw, we would call that a bad outcome. Notice that we have not yet discussed anyone's intentions. We've simply evaluated what happened. Throughout life, we constantly judge outcomes. Businesses evaluate outcomes. Scientists evaluate outcomes. Engineers evaluate outcomes. Governments should also evaluate outcomes. But evaluating outcomes alone does not tell us why those outcomes occurred. Intentions belong to another category entirely. The words benevolence and malevolence describe motives. They answer questions such as, why was this policy proposed? What problem was it trying to solve? What was the decision-maker attempting to accomplish? A benevolent intention seeks to produce benefit. A malevolent intention seeks to produce harm. Notice that intentions exist before outcomes occur. People often make decisions believing they are helping others. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes they create consequences they never imagined. That is why intentions and outcomes should never be confused. They answer two entirely different questions. Now we come to the final category. Virtue and evil describe moral character. More specifically, in politics they describe the moral use of power. Power itself is neither good nor evil. A hammer can build a home. The same hammer can be used as a weapon. The tool is neutral. Moral character depends upon how it is used. Government power works in much the same way. The authority to tax, regulate, imprison, or wage war is not automatically virtuous, nor is it automatically evil. What matters is how that authority is exercised and whether it remains faithful to the legitimate purpose for which government exists. As we move through the remainder of this presentation, keeping these categories separate will become increasingly important. Political values describe what government exists to protect. Good and bad describe outcomes. Benevolence and malevolence describe intentions. Political virtue and political evil describe the moral use of governmental power. Once these categories are understood, many political arguments begin to look very different. One of the greatest obstacles to productive political discussion is that people often combine several different ideas into one judgment. Someone observes a policy they dislike and immediately concludes that it was created by bad people with evil intentions. But that conclusion skips several important steps. Political values describe what government is trying to protect. Intentions describe why someone acted. Outcomes describe what actually happened. Morality evaluates the ethical use of power. These are four separate categories. Yet in everyday political conversation they are often treated as if they were interchangeable. That confusion leads people to believe that every bad outcome must have resulted from evil intentions, or that every good outcome proves moral virtue. Neither conclusion is logically sound. If we want to understand politics clearly, we must first learn to keep these categories separate. History provides countless examples of well-intentioned policies that failed to produce the results their supporters hoped for. A government may create a new program intending to reduce poverty. Another may pass regulations intending to improve public safety. A city may approve a large infrastructure project believing it will stimulate economic growth. The intentions may be entirely sincere. Yet the program may become inefficient. The regulations may create unintended costs. The project may exceed its budget or fail to deliver the expected benefits. None of these outcomes automatically prove that those responsible were attempting to harm the public. Good intentions do not guarantee good results. This distinction is important because constitutional government should evaluate both intentions and outcomes, rather than assuming one tells us everything about the other. Now consider the opposite mistake. A bridge collapses because engineers overlooked a structural weakness. A company introduces a product that later proves unreliable. A government agency responds too slowly during a natural disaster. These failures may have serious consequences. People may lose money. Communities may suffer. Lives may even be lost. But before concluding that evil occurred, we should ask another question. Was anyone deliberately attempting to produce those harmful results? Mistakes are not automatically evil. Poor judgment is not automatically evil. Incomplete information is not automatically evil. Human beings are imperfect. Organizations are imperfect. Governments are imperfect. The existence of failure alone does not establish the existence of evil. Evil requires something more than error. One of the most common reasons policies fail is something economists, engineers, and historians all recognize: unintended consequences. Every decision creates effects beyond those originally anticipated. Sometimes those effects are beneficial. Sometimes they are harmful. Sometimes they appear years later. For example, a regulation designed to protect consumers may also increase the cost of doing business. A tax incentive intended to encourage investment may unintentionally favor one industry over another. A subsidy created to solve one problem may create dependence somewhere else. None of these outcomes necessarily reflect bad intentions. They remind us that complex systems rarely respond exactly as expected. This is one reason humility is so important in government. Even well-designed policies can produce surprises. Recognizing unintended consequences encourages careful evaluation rather than immediate moral judgment. At this point, we can begin to see why these distinctions are so valuable. If we confuse outcomes with intentions, we begin accusing people of motives we cannot actually know. If we confuse intentions with morality, we excuse harmful actions simply because someone meant well. If we confuse political values with party slogans, we lose sight of the constitutional purpose of government altogether. Clear thinking requires clear categories. This principle is true in engineering. It is true in science. It is true in medicine. And it is equally true in politics. The Constitution was written to provide a framework for reasoned self-government. That framework depends upon citizens who are willing to examine evidence carefully, distinguish between different kinds of questions, and avoid drawing conclusions that the facts do not support. When we separate values, intentions, outcomes, and morality, political discussions become less emotional and far more productive. Only then are we prepared to examine one of the most revealing illustrations in this presentation: the story of the spider and the fly. Let's step away from politics for a moment and consider a simple event in nature. A spider builds a web. A fly becomes trapped. The spider survives because it has found food. The fly dies because it has become food. Nothing about this event is unusual. It happens millions of times every day throughout the natural world. Yet this simple example raises an interesting question. Was the spider good? Was the spider evil? Most people instinctively answer neither. The spider was simply acting according to its nature. It was surviving. The fly, unfortunately, was not. Already we begin to see an important distinction between outcomes and morality. Now ask a different question. Who benefited? From the spider's perspective, the outcome was excellent. The spider obtained nourishment. It may survive another day because it successfully captured prey. From the fly's perspective, however, the outcome could not have been worse. Its life ended. The exact same event produced two completely different evaluations. Neither perspective is irrational. Each reflects the interests of the organism experiencing the outcome. Perspective changes how outcomes are perceived. That observation will become very important when we return to politics. This illustrates something we encounter frequently in public policy. One group benefits. Another group bears the cost. A tax reduction may increase investment for businesses while reducing government revenue. An environmental regulation may improve air quality while increasing manufacturing costs. A highway project may shorten travel times for thousands of commuters while requiring a small number of families to relocate. The same decision can create benefits and burdens at the same time. People naturally evaluate those decisions from different perspectives. Recognizing this does not tell us which policy is correct. It simply reminds us that outcomes alone do not answer every moral question. Perspective matters. The natural world does not assign moral labels. Gravity is not evil. Fire is not evil. Earthquakes are not evil. Disease is not evil. Nature simply operates according to physical laws. The spider catches the fly because that is how the natural system functions. Nature does not stop to ask whether the result was fair. Human beings often make the mistake of projecting moral judgments onto events that are simply occurring. Morality enters the picture only when a being possesses the ability to understand alternatives and intentionally choose among them. That distinction separates human society from the rest of the natural world. Unlike the spider, human beings possess moral agency. We can reason. We can anticipate consequences. We can imagine different futures. We can choose one course of action over another. Most importantly, we can accept responsibility for those choices. This capacity changes everything. When a government adopts a policy, it is making choices. When a corporation develops a product, it is making choices. When citizens vote, they are making choices. Those choices can be evaluated not only by their outcomes but also by their intentions and by whether they respect the rights of others. Because human beings possess moral agency, we are accountable for how we exercise power. That accountability forms the foundation of constitutional government. The Constitution assumes that those entrusted with authority are capable of making moral choices and therefore must also be accountable to the people they serve. The lesson of the spider and the fly is not that harmful outcomes are acceptable. The lesson is that outcomes alone do not establish morality. Only when choice enters the picture do questions of virtue and evil truly begin. If we're going to discuss political virtue and political evil, we first need to understand what we mean by harm. Not all harmful actions are the same. Some affect only the individual making the decision. Others directly injure another person. Still others affect entire communities or future generations. To make these distinctions clearer, I find it useful to think about harm in 4 broad categories. The first is harm directed toward oneself. The second is harm directed toward other individuals. The third is harm directed toward the environment upon which society depends. The fourth is collective harm, where governments, corporations, or institutions use their power in ways that affect large numbers of people. These categories are not intended to rank one form of harm above another. Rather, they help us understand the different ways harmful actions occur and the different responsibilities that accompany them. The first category is harm directed toward oneself. Human beings possess remarkable freedom. With that freedom comes the ability to make both wise and unwise choices. Substance abuse provides one example. Chronic neglect of one's physical or mental health provides another. Deliberately engaging in self-destructive behavior can reduce opportunities, damage relationships, and shorten life itself. In many cases, the immediate victim is the individual making the decision. That does not mean others are unaffected. Families, friends, and communities often experience the consequences as well. Nevertheless, the primary harm begins with the individual. A free society recognizes that individuals possess both rights and responsibilities. Liberty includes the freedom to make choices, but it also includes responsibility for the consequences of those choices. The second category is harm directed toward another person. Most criminal laws exist because society recognizes this type of harm. Theft deprives someone of property. Fraud deprives someone of honest dealing. Violence threatens life and personal security. Abuse destroys trust and human dignity. Unlike self-directed harm, these actions intentionally impose costs upon another individual. Every stable society develops laws against these behaviors because protecting people from unjustified harm is one of government's most fundamental responsibilities. Notice once again that intention matters. An accidental injury is not the same as an intentional assault. A misunderstanding is not the same as deliberate fraud. The outcome may be similar, but the moral evaluation is often very different. The third category involves harm directed toward the environment. Human civilization depends upon healthy natural systems. Clean water, clean air, healthy soil, forests, fisheries, energy resources. The environment provides the foundation upon which economies and communities are built. Actions that knowingly damage these systems can affect not only today's population but generations yet to come. This category is often politically controversial because reasonable people disagree about the best balance between environmental protection and economic development. Those disagreements are legitimate. The important point is not that every environmental policy is right or wrong. The important point is recognizing that the environment itself is a legitimate subject of public responsibility because human well-being depends upon it. The constitutional challenge is finding policies that preserve both liberty and long-term prosperity. The final category is collective harm. This occurs when organizations possessing significant power affect large numbers of people. Governments, corporations, financial institutions, international organizations. Large institutions possess resources and authority that no individual can match. A single decision made by one of these organizations may influence thousands, millions, or even entire nations. A government may enact a law that changes the lives of every citizen. A corporation may manufacture a defective product distributed around the world. A financial institution may make decisions that influence entire economies. Because the scale of these decisions is so large, the responsibility associated with them is also much greater. This is one reason constitutional government places such importance on limiting power, dividing authority, and creating systems of accountability. The greater the ability to affect others, the greater the obligation to exercise that power responsibly. As we move into the next section, we'll examine why governments deserve particularly careful scrutiny. Not because governments are inherently evil, but because they possess powers unlike any other institution in society. Up to this point, we've examined political values, intentions, outcomes, morality, and the different levels of harm. Now we arrive at an important question. Why do we spend so much time evaluating government? The answer is simple. Government possesses powers that ordinary citizens do not. Government can tax. Government can regulate. Government can imprison. Government can wage war. Government can seize property under certain legal conditions. Government can restrict liberty through due process of law. No private citizen possesses these authorities. The Constitution recognizes these extraordinary powers, but it also places limits upon them. Every branch of government exists within a framework designed to prevent the abuse of power. The existence of governmental authority is not the problem. The challenge is ensuring that such authority is exercised wisely, lawfully, and constitutionally. When evaluating actions, the scale of their impact matters. Suppose one individual makes a poor financial decision. The consequences may affect that person and perhaps their family. Now imagine Congress passes a law that changes the tax code for the entire nation. Or imagine a president commits military forces overseas. Or imagine the Supreme Court issues a decision that changes how the Constitution is interpreted. These decisions affect millions of people simultaneously. As authority increases, so does the potential for both benefit and harm. This is one reason constitutional government distributes power among different institutions. The greater the authority, the greater the need for caution. Large decisions should never depend entirely upon the judgment of one individual. Checks and balances exist because the consequences of governmental decisions are so far-reaching. Extraordinary power carries extraordinary responsibility. Those entrusted with governmental authority should expect their decisions to receive careful public scrutiny. That scrutiny is not hostility toward government. It is one of the essential features of self-government. The Constitution creates multiple forms of accountability. Elections allow citizens to replace leaders. Congress oversees the executive branch. Courts review the constitutionality of laws. A free press informs the public. Citizens themselves remain responsible for staying informed and participating in public life. Transparency allows mistakes to be discovered. Oversight discourages abuses of power. Accountability helps preserve liberty. These constitutional safeguards exist because the framers understood an enduring truth. Power without accountability eventually becomes dangerous. Because governments make decisions affecting millions of people, they will inevitably make mistakes. History is filled with examples of policies that failed. Economic forecasts prove inaccurate. Military strategies sometimes fail. Infrastructure projects exceed their budgets. Public health programs occasionally produce unexpected results. None of these outcomes automatically indicate evil. Government consists of human beings. Human beings possess limited knowledge. They make imperfect decisions based upon incomplete information. Sometimes circumstances change after decisions have already been made. Recognizing this reality encourages humility. Citizens should certainly criticize ineffective policies. Governments should certainly correct their mistakes. But constitutional analysis requires us to distinguish between incompetence, poor judgment, unintended consequences, and deliberate wrongdoing. Failure alone does not establish evil. This brings us to one of the central ideas of this presentation. If mistakes are not automatically evil, if unintended consequences are not automatically evil, then what distinguishes political evil from ordinary human failure? The answer lies in the deliberate use of power. Political evil occurs when authority is knowingly exercised to produce unjustified harm. It is not merely the existence of harm that matters. It is the intentional misuse of power. When those entrusted with authority knowingly deny fundamental rights. When they deliberately suppress liberty. When they intentionally place personal power above the well-being of the people. They have crossed a moral boundary. Political evil is not measured by party affiliation. It is not determined by campaign slogans. It is not established by public opinion. Political evil is measured by whether governmental power is deliberately used to deny, suppress, or destroy the conditions necessary for free people to live, prosper, and govern themselves. Before we decide whether a political party is good or evil, we should first ask a much simpler question. What is a political party? A political party is not a government. It is not a constitution. It is not a moral being. A political party is a voluntary association of citizens who share certain goals, priorities, and ideas about public policy. People join political parties because they believe those organizations are the best vehicles for advancing particular policies. Some value lower taxes. Others prioritize environmental protection. Some focus on national security. Others emphasize healthcare or education. Political parties organize these competing priorities into platforms that candidates present to the public. In other words, a political party is simply a coalition of citizens attempting to influence how government exercises its constitutional powers. Once we understand what a political party is, another reality becomes obvious. No political party consists of people who all think alike. Within every party are millions of individuals. Each has a different background, a different occupation, a different education, a different life experience, a different reason for voting. One voter may support a candidate because of economic policy, another because of foreign policy, another because of judicial appointments, another because of healthcare, another simply because they believe the alternative would be worse. Even people voting for the same candidate often disagree on many issues. Reducing millions of citizens to a single motivation ignores the complexity of human decision-making. Human beings are individuals long before they become members of any political organization. This brings us to an important distinction. Moral responsibility belongs to moral agents. Individuals possess moral agency because individuals make choices. Political parties do not possess consciousness. They do not possess intentions independent of the people who comprise them. They are organizations. Organizations may adopt policies. Organizations may establish rules. Organizations may influence public debate. But they are not moral beings in the same sense that individual human beings are. To describe an entire political party as inherently virtuous or inherently evil is to assign moral character to an organization rather than carefully evaluating the actions of the individuals and institutions operating within it. Constitutional analysis requires greater precision than that. It asks us to evaluate actions, policies, and uses of governmental power, not slogans or labels. Labels are useful because they simplify communication. Unfortunately, they also simplify reality. When someone says, "That is the good party," or "That is the evil party," an enormous amount of complexity disappears. Individual people disappear. Different motivations disappear. Nuanced policy discussions disappear. Historical context disappears. The label becomes a substitute for thinking. Instead of asking whether a particular proposal is constitutional, effective, or just, people often stop at the label itself. If the label is favorable, the policy is accepted. If the label is unfavorable, the policy is rejected. But constitutional government demands more of its citizens than simple tribal loyalty. It asks us to evaluate each policy on its own merits. This leads us to perhaps the most important question in this section. Can millions of Americans honestly be reduced to one moral category? Consider what such a claim would require. It would require believing that millions of people, with different experiences, beliefs, occupations, religions, cultures, and motivations, all possess essentially the same moral character simply because they belong to the same political party. That is an extraordinary claim. It is also inconsistent with how we normally judge individuals. We do not assume that every member of a profession is morally identical. We do not assume that every resident of a state shares the same character. Nor should we assume that every member of a political party possesses identical intentions or identical values. In a constitutional republic, citizens deserve to be judged as individuals. Policies deserve to be judged on their constitutional merits. And governments deserve to be judged by how faithfully they secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Reducing millions of Americans to the labels of good or evil may be emotionally satisfying, but it does not produce careful constitutional analysis. It produces political tribalism. And political tribalism is one of the greatest threats to reasoned self-government. One of the most revolutionary ideas in human history appears in the Declaration of Independence. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. That single sentence transformed the relationship between citizens and government. In many societies throughout history, rulers claimed authority by birth, conquest, or divine right. The American system rejected those ideas. Instead, governmental authority begins with the people. Citizens elect representatives. Representatives exercise governmental power. That power remains legitimate only because it ultimately comes from those who are governed. This principle places enormous trust in the American people. It assumes that free citizens are capable of governing themselves. But with that authority comes responsibility. Self-government is not something that happens only on election day. Citizens participate in government in many different ways. We vote. We debate. We petition our elected officials. We serve on juries. We attend public meetings. We write letters. We speak publicly. Some choose to run for office. Others volunteer for campaigns or civic organizations. Still others simply stay informed so they can make thoughtful decisions when elections arrive. All of these activities contribute to self-government. The Constitution distributes power not only among branches of government but also throughout society itself. A healthy republic depends upon active, informed citizens who recognize that preserving liberty requires ongoing participation. Democracy is not merely a system of rights. It is also a system of responsibilities. Now we arrive at a question that deserves careful thought. If governmental authority comes from the people, and if elected officials exercise authority on behalf of the people, then what responsibility do citizens bear when government acts wrongly? This is not an easy question. Suppose Congress passes a law that later proves harmful. Suppose an administration adopts a policy that produces unintended consequences. Suppose a court issues a controversial decision. Who bears responsibility? Only the elected officials? Only those who voted for them? Or does responsibility become more broadly shared within a system of self-government? There is no simple answer. The purpose of asking this question is not to assign blame. The purpose is to remind us that citizenship carries moral responsibility as well as political rights. Most Americans vote for many different reasons. Very few agree with every position taken by any candidate. A voter may support one candidate because of economic policy while disagreeing with that candidate's foreign policy. Another may prioritize judicial appointments. Another may focus on healthcare, education, immigration, or national security. Many voters choose what they believe is the better of two imperfect alternatives. Others vote strategically. Still others vote against a candidate rather than for one. Once elected, representatives frequently confront issues that were never discussed during the campaign. Circumstances change. New information emerges. Unexpected crises arise. As a result, citizens cannot reasonably be held morally responsible for every decision made by those they helped elect. The relationship between voters and government is real, but it is neither absolute nor simple. This realization teaches an important lesson. Reasonable people often reach different conclusions while pursuing the same constitutional objectives. One citizen may believe a particular policy best protects liberty. Another may sincerely believe that the same policy threatens liberty. One may emphasize security. Another may emphasize individual freedom. One may focus on short-term costs. Another may focus on long-term benefits. Disagreement alone does not prove bad intentions. Nor does it prove moral failure. A constitutional republic depends upon citizens who are willing to acknowledge that honest people can disagree. Humility allows us to recognize that our own understanding may be incomplete. It encourages us to listen before condemning, to ask questions before assigning motives, to evaluate evidence before reaching conclusions. The Constitution was never intended to eliminate disagreement. It was designed to provide a peaceful process through which free people with different opinions could govern themselves together. That may be one of its greatest achievements. At this point, we've built a framework for constitutional analysis. Now it's time to use it. When a new law is proposed, when a government program is announced, or when political leaders argue over public policy, the first question should not be, which party proposed it? Nor should the question be, which ideology supports it? Instead, the constitutional citizen asks a much simpler question. What is the policy? Before deciding whether we support or oppose an idea, we should first understand what it actually does. What problem is it attempting to solve? What authority does government possess to implement it? Who benefits? Who bears the cost? Every policy deserves to be examined on its own merits. Party labels should never substitute for constitutional analysis. Once we understand the policy itself, we evaluate its outcomes. What actually happened? Did the policy solve the problem it was intended to address? Did it create new problems that were not anticipated? Were the benefits greater than the costs? Did unintended consequences emerge? Constitutional government requires citizens who are willing to examine evidence honestly. Sometimes a policy succeeds. Sometimes it fails. Sometimes it succeeds in one area while creating difficulties in another. Evaluating outcomes requires humility because facts often challenge our assumptions. Our loyalty should never be to a political party. Our loyalty should be to the truth. If the evidence shows that a policy failed, we should be willing to acknowledge that failure and seek a better solution. After examining outcomes, we should ask another important question. What were the intentions? Was the policy proposed in an honest effort to solve a legitimate public problem? Or was it designed primarily to benefit a narrow interest at the expense of others? Intentions matter because they reveal the purpose behind the exercise of governmental power. At the same time, we should be cautious. Human beings cannot directly observe another person's motives. We often infer intentions from words, actions, and patterns of behavior, but we should avoid confidently assigning motives without sufficient evidence. Constitutional analysis encourages us to distinguish between demonstrated facts and personal assumptions. Good intentions do not excuse harmful outcomes. Likewise, harmful outcomes do not automatically prove malicious intent. Both deserve careful examination. Now we arrive at the most important question of all. Does this policy remain faithful to the purpose for which government was created? Does it protect life? Does it preserve liberty? Does it expand or restrict the pursuit of happiness? Does it respect the constitutional rights of individuals? Does it exercise governmental authority within the limits established by the Constitution? These questions move the discussion away from personalities and toward principles. The Declaration of Independence provides the purpose. The Constitution provides the process. Together they establish the standard against which governmental actions should be measured. Regardless of who proposes a policy, every proposal should be tested against these constitutional principles. One final question remains. What values are competing? Public policy rarely involves choosing between something that is entirely good and something that is entirely bad. More often, it involves balancing legitimate values. Security may compete with liberty. Economic development may compete with environmental protection. Individual freedom may compete with public safety. Short-term costs may compete with long-term benefits. Recognizing these trade-offs encourages thoughtful discussion instead of emotional accusations. Reasonable people may weigh competing values differently while remaining equally committed to constitutional government. The objective is not to eliminate disagreement. The objective is to understand the nature of the disagreement. Once we recognize which constitutional values are in tension, meaningful debate becomes possible. Rather than asking, who is good, or who is evil, we begin asking, which course of action best secures life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness while respecting the rights of all? That is the question constitutional government asks its citizens to answer. We have now reached the point where we can offer a constitutional definition of political virtue. Political virtue is not loyalty to a political party. It is not agreement with a particular ideology. It is not determined by public opinion or election results. Political virtue is measured by how governmental power is exercised. From the perspective of the Declaration of Independence, government exists to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Therefore, political virtue consists of exercising governmental authority in ways that protect and preserve those rights. A virtuous government protects life without unnecessarily sacrificing liberty. It preserves liberty while maintaining justice. It creates conditions under which individuals may pursue happiness according to their own goals and aspirations. Political virtue requires wisdom because these values must often be balanced against one another. It requires humility because no government possesses perfect knowledge. And it requires restraint because the Constitution deliberately limits governmental power. Political virtue is not measured by how much power government possesses. It is measured by how faithfully that power serves its constitutional purpose. If political virtue secures the rights of the people, then political evil can also be defined constitutionally. Political evil is not disagreement. It is not political opposition. It is not belonging to a different political party. Political evil occurs when governmental power is deliberately used to deny, suppress, or destroy the conditions necessary for free people to live, prosper, and govern themselves. Notice the importance of the word deliberately. Mistakes are not political evil. Poor judgment is not political evil. Failed policies are not automatically political evil. Political evil requires the intentional misuse of governmental authority. History offers many examples. Governments that deliberately silence dissent. Governments that intentionally imprison political opponents without due process. Governments that knowingly deny fundamental rights to certain groups of citizens. Governments that intentionally use fear, violence, or coercion to preserve their own power. These actions are not simply ineffective. They represent a conscious departure from the constitutional purpose of government. Political evil is measured not by party labels but by the deliberate misuse of power. Once political disagreements become battles between good and evil, something dangerous begins to happen. Political opponents stop being viewed as fellow citizens. They become enemies. Compromise begins to look like surrender. Debate becomes hostility. Every election becomes an existential struggle. Every disagreement becomes a moral crisis. History reminds us that societies become unstable when citizens lose the ability to distinguish disagreement from disloyalty. Constitutional government depends upon mutual respect among people who often hold very different opinions. When political tribalism replaces constitutional reasoning, the institutions of self-government begin to weaken. Citizens become more interested in defeating one another than in solving common problems. That is why moral tribalism poses such a serious danger to a constitutional republic. The Constitution offers a different path. It assumes that free people will disagree. It does not attempt to eliminate those disagreements. Instead, it establishes a peaceful process for managing them. Elections replace violence. Debate replaces coercion. Representation replaces domination. Checks and balances replace concentrated power. The rule of law replaces the arbitrary rule of individuals. This constitutional framework allows people with profoundly different beliefs to remain fellow citizens rather than becoming permanent enemies. We can disagree about taxes. We can disagree about healthcare. We can disagree about foreign policy, education, immigration, or environmental protection. Yet despite those disagreements, we remain participants in the same constitutional system. That is one of the greatest achievements of the American experiment in self-government. The Constitution does not require unanimous agreement. It requires peaceful disagreement under the rule of law. Let's return to the question with which we began. Are good and evil political values? The answer is no. Political values are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Good and bad describe outcomes. Benevolence and malevolence describe intentions. Political virtue and political evil describe the moral use of governmental power. Throughout this presentation we have seen why those distinctions matter. Without them, political discussions become emotional rather than analytical. Policies become labels. Opponents become enemies. Citizens begin judging one another instead of evaluating governmental actions according to constitutional principles. The Constitution offers a better approach. It asks us to judge government not by personalities or parties but by whether it faithfully secures the rights it was created to protect. Our responsibility as citizens is not to decide which political party deserves the title of good and which deserves the title of evil. Our responsibility is to remain informed, to think critically, to participate responsibly, and to hold government accountable to its constitutional purpose. Ultimately, political virtue seeks to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Political evil deliberately seeks to deny, suppress, or destroy those conditions. A constitutional republic succeeds not by deciding which party is good and which party is evil, but by giving free people a peaceful way to resolve their disagreements while preserving the rights and freedoms of all. Thank you.